Thank you so much for having me here. Wade Khoidup, Julian Brave Noisecat when Squext, when Kika had a squest wa Alexander Radiath, when Kikach had a squest wa Edarchi Noisecat, Sequat Mochken as Statlim and its Asken which deck when Let when Poopsman Eliatek to me was Piscataway Uluch. Hello everyone, I just wanted to introduce my most immediate ancestors and bring them into the room, and that's my mom and dad. And I wanted to sort of speak to you in my language, the Secwepemc language, which has fewer than 200 remaining fluent speakers, one of whom is my own grandmother, and she passed on some of that language, a small fraction, to me. And I wanted to begin with that because words matter, but also because land matters, because where we are matters. And so I also want to acknowledge our presence today on the traditional territory of the Piscataway people, whose homelands we stand upon here in Washington, D.C. So back in January, I traveled to the Yankton Reservation in South Dakota, where in the bingo hall of the Fort Randall Casino, leaders of the Oceti-Sakowin Nation, a community more commonly known as the Sioux, had gathered to reaffirm the international treaty to protect the sacred. That treaty was first signed there in 2013, uniting indigenous nations in the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline and the expansion of fossil fuel projects emanating out of the tar sands in Alberta, the Bakken in North Dakota, the San Juan Basin in the Four Corners, the Permian in Texas, and in the pipelines that snake their way across the continent, connecting these wildcatting booms to power plants and gas pumps around the world. So riding this oil boom, the United States actually surpassed Saudi Arabia to become the single largest oil producer in the world, pumping more than 10 million barrels per day in 2018, according to the International Energy Agency, which is the authority on these matters. Not me, they. So the combustion of all that fossil fuel is, right now, driving the planet to a new atmospheric chemistry. In May, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the air reached 415 parts per million for the first time in 3 million years. The last time that happened, forests grew in Antarctica, the Greenland ice sheet did not yet exist, and sea levels were more than 50 feet higher than they are today. Our species, people who we would identify as Homo sapiens, did not yet walk the earth. The United States provides the fossil fuel industry over $500 billion in direct and indirect subsidies every year, according to a radical organization called the International Monetary Fund. This includes access to cheap leases on public lands, quick and easy permitting processes, and, as we learned at Standing Rock, the cooperation of law enforcement agencies that can serve as mini private armies. In the 1970s, scholars coined the term petrostate to describe a form of state development built from the revenue of the oil rig. But back when the Saudi Arabias and Venezuelas of the world started drilling, the greenhouse effect was little more than a theory, and it would have been inconceivable to power an industrial economy without fossil fuel. Today, of course, we know the science, and we have cheap solar panels. Our economy transacts in nearly $20 trillion every single year. We could do things a lot differently, but instead we have doubled down. Since Dr. James Hansen testified in Congress in 1988, creating widespread awareness of global warming, humans have spewed more carbon into the atmosphere than in all prior history. Renewable energy is in many places now cheaper than fossil fuel, and its price continues to drop. Yet on we go. After 3 years of decline, U.S. emissions went up. They got a little Trump bump of 3.4% in 2018. President Trump has described global warming, as I'm sure many of you have heard, as a hoax invented by the Chinese, and boasts that, quote, the golden era of American energy is now underway. At present, the United States, in league with fossil fuel corporations, has become a uniquely destructive force in global history, one that we may need a new vocabulary to describe, a necrostate, perhaps. Against destruction, more and more people are rising up. Some of them are sitting right here. Indigenous communities have been among the boldest of these dissidents, asserting our own authority to stop the construction of pipelines and enact a more just relationship between land and people to protect the sacred. South Dakota, where I was back in January, is the land of the Fort Laramie Treaties of 1851 and 1868. Each treaty guaranteed the Oceti-Sakowin large homelands in the center of the continent. Each was broken even before the ink on the parchment dried. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States had violated the treaty when, in 1874, it opened the Oceti-Sakowin sacred Black Hills to prospectors. The court ordered the government to pay $88 million in restitution. With interest, the settlement is worth now more than $1 billion. Let me repeat that. With interest, that settlement is worth more than $1 billion today. The Oceti-Sakowin, whose reservations are among the poorest census districts in the United States, have refused to accept that compensation. They've said no. They still say no. And they insist that their sacred Black Hills are not for sale. Under the authority of the same treaty and others, tribes have been fighting the Keystone XL pipeline, which would contribute 24.3 million metric tons of CO2 emissions per year. That's the equivalent of Americans driving more than 60 billion additional miles on the road every single year. It's a lot of cars. The project has been tied up in legal battles for the last decade, though industry experts and anti-pipeline activists anticipate construction could begin in 2020. In anticipation of opposition, the South Dakota legislature passed a new anti-protest law that would target opponents of the Keystone XL pipeline, including ranchers, environmentalists, and tribes, with fines for a new crime called riot boosting. Governor Kristi Noem signed the bill into law less than 3 days after its legislative text was introduced into the legislature. The ACLU has since challenged the law as an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment. The Oceti-Sakowin would add that it's also a violation of their treaty rights. In the red states that some journalists have taken to calling Trump country, the founding documents of this country, that is the Constitution, and the more than 300 treaties signed with Native nations so that these United States could stretch from sea to shining sea, are dead letter. These are the circumstances that transformed pipelines like Keystone XL and Dakota Access into national news. For a decade, pipeline politics shifted the center of gravity in the environmental movement. In 2016, more than 1 million people, including I imagine some in this room, checked in at Standing Rock to show solidarity with the fight against Dakota Access. A Puerto Rican bartender from the Bronx was among thousands of millennials who organized in support. Her name was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, like the indigenous movements against Keystone XL and Dakota Access before it, has reshaped the landscape of American politics. 106 members of Congress have co-sponsored a Green New Deal resolution, and 18 presidential candidates have endorsed the vision, including progressive frontrunners Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Data for Progress, the think tank where I work, consistently finds robust public support for the Green New Deal, which in turn has brought a word not often associated with global warming into the conversation, and that is justice. AOC and Green New Deal advocates, to their credit, have done a great deal to include issues of environmental racism and injustice in the early design of the Green New Deal. Last month, for example, California Senator Kamala Harris and Representative Ocasio-Cortez introduced the Climate Equity Act, which would prioritize investments in frontline communities in climate action. Earlier this year, New York State passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which similarly mandates green investments in low-income communities of color. During CNN's town hall on the climate crisis, which lasted 7 hours, 9 candidates directly or indirectly referenced environmental justice. But one senses that buzzwords like environmental justice and frontline communities are empty signifiers, empty not because those who invoke them don't genuinely care, but because these terms have yet to be filled with programmatic substance, with what justice might look like for the Oceti-Sakowin, for example, or the South Bronx, for that matter. What would it mean to think about communities on the front line of climate change and pollution, not only as people in harm's way or as passive beneficiaries of investment, but instead as architects and drivers of a Green New Deal? So for a moment, let's revert our gaze from the votes we can whip out of lawmakers in this city and the blaring studio lighting of the made-for-TV stage and return to the bingo hall of the Fort Randall Casino on the Yankton Reservation. What would a Green New Deal look like if we started building there? Well, as it turns out, the foundation, if not the inspiration for a Green New Deal, already exists in Indigenous communities across the continent. Most, including the best intentioned, just don't bother to look. In the values that have called some of the poorest people in the United States to stand up against the largest oil corporations in the world, we might find the courage that we need to win this fight against all the odds. In our Constitution, which protects the right to protest, we might remember that democracy is at least as important and powerful a tool in the fight against climate change as decarbonization. In the treaties that the Constitution describes as the supreme law of the land, we might find the basis for a more just and equal relationship between tribes and the federal government, one where pipelines cannot be built through tribal lands without consent. In the sovereignty of Indigenous nations, we might find new partners for not only a multiracial, but also a plurinational democracy. In many places like South Dakota, where the Oceti-Sakowin have stopped the Keystone XL pipeline for the last decade, Indigenous nations have shown how tribes can protect the environment in this perilous age of greed and warming. And through Indigenous nations' inherent right and enduring self-determination, we might begin to reimagine and rebuild the state as a home for the many nations of this continent, especially its First Nations. And from the intergenerational memory and experience of a people who survived a genocide and know what it means to live through the end of their world, humanity might learn a thing or two about how to endure through the climate crisis. So what might a Green New Deal built with rather than for Indigenous peoples look like? It would look like honoring what came before: the treaties, the tribes, the rivers from which we drink, the air which we breathe, the land where we plant and gather our food, and to which we return when our time is up. And by finally honoring these things, which have always been there, but which this country has never properly respected or protected, we might build something green and new. Back in February at the Fort Randall Casino, I was asked to sign the international treaty to protect the sacred as the lone representative of the St'át'imc Nation in attendance. When it was my turn to speak, I decided to share my great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Harry Nkashusha Peters' song, which many forces, germs, governments, missionaries, and markets conspired to take away from my family, but which we still remember and sing today. We may need some new technology to fight climate change. Better batteries certainly would not hurt. But in truth, a Green New Deal can be built mostly through the power of things that are always here and that always will be here: the sun, the wind, the indigenous, people like you, but whose potential we have yet to fully unlock. Thank you guys so much for having me. And I think, one, if anyone wants to get involved in the fight against the Keystone XL pipeline, there is a commitment that you can make. It's called the Promise to Protect. It is being organized by the Oceti-Sakowin themselves in collaboration with organizations like 350.org, where I used to work, And I just want to say thank you all for listening and for being here. It's really important that people like yourselves are learning and are getting engaged in this fight and figuring out what the best way that what they can do to help. So, thank you.